Albert Einstein famously said that if World War III were fought with all the available technologies, then World War IV would be fought with sticks and stones. Since his time, thousands of dystopian fictions have described the anarchy that would follow a thermonuclear exchange. The world's libraries and museums would be ransacked in order to gather fuel for campfires. After a generation, human beings would revert to being hunters and gatherers. The gains our species made in the last 5,000 years would be erased. Einstein told us that if the United Nations did not evolve into a genuine world government, able to deploy an effective international police force, a nuclear exchange would be inevitable sooner or later. Nothing we've learned since weakens his argument, but we now know something Einstein didn't, namely that rich playboys like Osama bin Laden can accomplish feats that were once possible only for national governments. Our only comfort is that the terrorists will probably turn the clock back only 200 years rather than 5,000. For what we now fear is not so much the death and suffering that their infernal machines can cause, but the loss of liberty that will come about as a result of Western governments' reactions to terrorist attack. We now worry not about the end of civilization, but rather about the end of various socio-political institutions that emerged in Europe and North America in the wake of the bourgeois revolutions. The widespread suspicion that the war on terrorism is potentially more dangerous than terrorism itself seems to me entirely justified. For if the direct effects of terrorism were all we had to worry about, there would be no reason to think that democratic institutions could not survive simultaneous nuclear explosions in many Western cities. Equivalent amounts of death and destruction caused by natural disasters would not threaten those institutions. If, for example, there were a sudden shift of tectonic plates that caused skyscrapers to collapse all around the Pacific Rim, hundreds of thousands of people would die within minutes. But after they'd been buried, rebuilding would proceed. Any emergency powers claimed by governments would be temporary and local. But if much less severe damage occurred as a result of terrorism, those who bear the responsibility for preventing further attacks will think it necessary to take steps that might well lead to the end of the rule of law and to the role of public opinion in determining government policy. Politicians and bureaucrats will outdo each other in claims of toughness by proposing more and more outrageous measures. The rage felt when immense suffering is caused by human agency rather than by natural causes will lead the public to accept those measures. The result will not be a fascist putsch, but rather a cascade of decisions that will gradually, in the course of a few years, bring about an irreversible change in the conditions of social life in the West. The courts will be brushed aside, and the judiciary will lose its independence. Regional military commanders will be given the kind of authority that once belonged to locally elected officials. The media will be coerced into suppressing protest against these changes. Fear of such developments is, of course, commoner among Americans like myself than among Europeans, for it's only in America that a permanent state of war has been proclaimed by the government. Christopher Hitchens has jeeringly said that many American leftists are more afraid of John Ashcroft, President Bush's Attorney General, than they are of Osama bin Laden. I am exactly the sort of person Hitchens has in mind. My first thought on hearing the news of 9/11 was the Bush administration will use this as the Nazis used the Reichstag fire. And that, I think, is pretty much what has happened. The White House immediately demanded emergency powers, and many of those were granted by Congress. So far, the courts have pretty much gone along, even to the extent of setting up secret dockets, a practice hitherto unknown in American law. Questions about the constitutionality of these new powers have been much debated in American law schools and will come before the Supreme Court next month. 250 towns and cities in the U.S. have passed resolutions against the USA Patriot Act, and some of them have directed local police forces not to cooperate with the federal government in enforcing the Act's provisions. Those who framed and passed those resolutions see the Patriot Act as a foretaste of much more extensive claims to emergency powers that will be made once the terrorists mount a few more successful attacks on the scale of 9/11 within the United States. The Patriot Act was a very complex omnium gatherum, 342 pages long. So was its British analog, the Anti-Terrorism, Crime and Security Act. Both were rushed through in the wake of 9/11. It's unlikely that most of the members of the American Congress or the British Parliament who voted for these acts knew what they contained. Both were presumably drawn up simply by asking the security agencies of each country to list the restrictions they found most inconvenient. Similar legislation will quickly be passed in any Western country in which Al-Qaeda or a similar group launches an attack, a successful attack on a similar scale. Though I do indeed regard John Ashcroft as a thoroughly sinister figure, I do not think the Bush administration is filled with power-hungry crypto-fascists. Neither are the German or the Spanish or the British governments. But I do think that the end of the rule of law could come about almost inadvertently in both the US and Europe through the sheer momentum of the institutional changes that are likely to be made in the name of waging war on terrorism. If there were a dozen successful attacks on European capitals, the military and the national security bureaucracy in each European country will be granted powers they had not previously wielded or dreamed of. The public will find this altogether fitting and proper. Local police forces will start working on instructions from the national capital. Updated versions of the Berufsverbot law will be passed by legislators anxious to demonstrate their patriotic resolve. The government will quickly label any criticism by the media a source of aid and comfort to terrorism. European ministers of justice will echo Ashcroft's reply to critics of the Patriot Act. Ashcroft said, quote, "To those who scare peace-loving people with phantoms of lost liberty, my message is this: your tactics only aid terrorists, for they erode our national unity and diminish our resolve." Such developments would gradually diminish the effectiveness of the various institutions that have made it possible for public opinion to influence the actions of democratic governments. At the end of this process of erosion, democracy would have been replaced by something quite different. This would probably be neither military dictatorship nor Orwellian totalitarianism, but rather a relatively benevolent despotism imposed by what would gradually become an hereditary nomenklatura. That sort of despotism survived the end of the Soviet Union and is now being re-solidified under Putin and his fellow KGB alumni.